The autumn wind of 1886 swept through Dodge City, Kansas, carrying with it the scent of dust and dying dreams. The once booming cattle town had begun to quiet, its wild days slowly fading like the setting sun over the endless prairie. In this changing world lived Silas McCrae, a man whose 43 years had been carved by solitude and hardship. "Hi, how are you? Sorry to interrupt your story, but what I'm going to ask you is really quick, and it will really help the channel to grow and create new stories. Just click below the video image to subscribe. You'll be doing an act of kindness and encouragement to those who are just starting out. Thank you very much, and continue with your story now." Silas rode his weathered horse, Thunder, down Front Street, his spurs jingling a lonely melody against the stirrups. His face, bronzed by countless days under the merciless sun, bore the lines of a man who had learned to expect little from life and even less from people. The McCrae Ranch, inherited from his father, struggled to survive in these changing times. The great cattle drives were becoming memories, and Silas found himself fighting a losing battle against debt and despair. "Morning, Silas," called out Martha Henderson, the town's seamstress, as she swept her porch. Her voice carried the forced cheerfulness of someone trying to bridge an uncomfortable silence. Silas touched the brim of his hat. "Ma'am," he replied, his voice gravelly from disuse. He wasn't much for conversation, and the townspeople had long since stopped trying to draw him out. As Thunder's hooves clattered against the wooden planks of the main street, Silas's attention was drawn to a commotion near the Dodge City orphanage. The modest building, run by the stern but kind-hearted Mrs. Eleanor Whitmore, housed the town's forgotten children. Today, a small crowd had gathered outside, their voices carrying a mixture of curiosity and cruel amusement. "Look at him go," laughed Tommy Brennan, the blacksmith's son. "Can't even keep up with the other kids." Silas dismounted, tying Thunder to a nearby post. Something in the scene pulled at him, though he couldn't say what. Through the gaps between the onlookers, he caught sight of a small figure struggling across the orphanage yard. The boy couldn't have been more than 10 years old, with sandy hair that caught the afternoon light and eyes the color of storm clouds. But it was his legs that drew the crowd's attention, twisted and weak, forcing him to drag himself forward with makeshift crutches carved from old fence posts. The other children had long since finished their game of tag, but this boy, Eli Thornton, continued his solitary journey across the yard, his jaw set with determination that seemed far too mature for his young face. "Eli, come inside now," called Mrs. Whitmore from the doorway, her voice gentle but firm. The crowd began to disperse, their entertainment over, but Silas remained rooted to the spot. As Eli struggled toward the building, one of his crutches caught in a rut, sending him tumbling to the ground. The few remaining onlookers chuckled, but Silas felt something twist in his chest. The boy didn't cry out or call for help. Instead, he simply gathered himself, retrieved his crutch, and continued on his way. "Poor little thing," whispered Mrs. Henderson, who had approached to see what the fuss was about. "Been here 3 years now, ever since his mama died of the fever. Father was a drunk who couldn't stand the sight of him after the accident that took his legs. Some folks say it's God's will, but I say it's just plain cruel." Silas watched as Eli finally reached the orphanage steps. The boy paused, looking back across the yard where the other children played, and for a moment, his carefully maintained composure cracked. In that instant, Silas saw something he recognized: the profound loneliness of someone who had learned to expect nothing from the world. "He's a bright one, though," continued Mrs. Henderson. "Mrs. Whitmore says he can read better than most grown folks and has a head for figures that'd make the bank clerk jealous. Shame about his condition. No family's going to take on that burden." The word burden hit Silas like a physical blow. He'd heard it applied to himself often enough. The burden of a failing ranch, the burden of a man who couldn't seem to fit into civilized society. But seeing it applied to a child, especially one who had shown such quiet courage, stirred something in Silas that had been dormant for years. That evening, as Silas sat on his porch watching the stars emerge over the Kansas plains, he couldn't shake the image of Eli's determined struggle across the yard. The boy's face haunted him, not with pity, but with recognition. They were both outsiders, both fighting battles that the world seemed determined to make them lose. Thunder nickered softly from the corral, and Silas realized he'd been sitting in the same position for hours. The autumn air had grown cold, but he barely noticed. His mind was elsewhere, turning over possibilities he'd never considered before. The next morning brought news that would change everything. Dr. Samuel Hartwell, a physician from Boston with a reputation for revolutionary surgical techniques, had arrived in Dodge City. Word spread quickly through the town. He was traveling west to study frontier medicine and had established a temporary practice in the old hotel. But it was another piece of news that truly captured Silas's attention. Mrs. Whitmore had approached Dr. Hartwell about Eli's condition, hoping the learned physician might offer some insight. The doctor had agreed to examine the boy, though he warned that such cases were often beyond help. As Silas rode into town that day, he found himself taking a detour past the orphanage. Through the window, he could see Eli sitting alone at a table, bent over what appeared to be a book far too advanced for his age. The other children played in the yard, their laughter drifting through the glass, but Eli seemed content in his solitude. "He reminds me of someone," Silas murmured to Thunder, though he wasn't ready to admit who that someone might be. The day passed slowly, but as evening approached, Silas made a decision that would alter the course of two lives forever. He dismounted outside the orphanage and knocked on the heavy wooden door. Mrs. Whitmore answered, her gray hair pulled back in a practical bun and her apron dusted with flour from the evening's baking. "Mr. McCrae," she said, surprise evident in her voice. "What brings you here?" "I'd like to speak with you about the boy," Silas said, his voice steady despite the uncertainty churning in his chest. "About Eli." Mrs. Whitmore's eyebrows rose, but she stepped aside to let him enter. "Of course. Please, come in." As they walked through the modest hallway, Silas caught a glimpse of Eli through an open doorway. The boy was helping a younger child with his letters, his patience evident as he guided the smaller boy's hand across the slate. There was something in that simple act of kindness that confirmed what Silas had already begun to suspect. This child was special in ways that had nothing to do with his physical limitations. "He's a remarkable boy," Mrs. Whitmore said, following Silas's gaze. "Too remarkable for his own good sometimes. The other children don't quite know what to make of him, and potential families—" She trailed off, but the meaning was clear. "I want to adopt him," Silas said, the words tumbling out before he could second-guess himself. Mrs. Whitmore stopped walking, her hand gripping the back of a nearby chair. "Mr. McCrae, are you certain? Eli requires special care, and your ranch, well, it's quite isolated. Maybe that's exactly what he needs," Silas replied, surprising himself with the conviction in his voice. "A place where he can be himself without folks staring and whispering." As if summoned by their conversation, Eli appeared in the doorway, his crutches tapping softly against the wooden floor. His storm-gray eyes met Silas's, and for a moment, neither spoke. "You're the cowboy from yesterday," Eli said finally, his voice clear and intelligent. "You watched me fall." "I did," Silas admitted. "I also watched you get back up." Something passed between them in that moment, an understanding that would form the foundation of everything to come. Neither Silas nor Eli could have imagined the extraordinary journey that lay ahead, or how their unlikely partnership would transform not only their own lives, but the very heart of Dodge City itself. 3 days after that fateful conversation at the orphanage, Silas McCrae found himself standing before Judge William Crawford in the cramped courthouse of Dodge City. The adoption papers lay spread across the oak desk like a map to an uncertain future, and the weight of every signature felt heavier than the iron brands he used on his cattle. "You understand what you're taking on, Silas?" Judge Crawford asked, his weathered fingers drumming against the desk. The judge had known Silas since boyhood, had watched him struggle to maintain the family ranch after his father's death. "This boy will need more care than most. And your situation—" "My situation is my own business, Judge," Silas replied firmly. "The boy needs a home, and I'm offering one." Judge Crawford studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. Very well, but understand, if you can't provide proper care, the county will step in. As they completed the paperwork, neither man noticed the small crowd gathering outside the courthouse. Word traveled fast in a town like Dodge City, and by the time Silas emerged with Eli at his side, half the town seemed to have materialized to witness the spectacle. "Well, I'll be damned," chuckled Frank Morrison, the town's banker, his round belly shaking with mirth. "Old Silas has gone and lost his mind completely. Ain't no lonesome cowboy got the sense nor sense to raise a crippled boy," cackled Widow Patterson, her voice carrying the sharp edge of someone who found pleasure in others' misfortunes. "Mark my words, he'll be back here within a month, begging the orphanage to take the child back." Eli's grip tightened on his crutches, his knuckles white against the worn wood. Silas felt the boy's tension and placed a protective hand on his shoulder. "Let them talk," Silas murmured, his voice low enough that only Eli could hear. "Words are just wind, son. It's what we do that matters." But the mockery followed them like a shadow. As they made their way to the general store to gather supplies, conversations stopped and started again in their wake. Children pointed and whispered, while their parents shook their heads in a mixture of pity and amusement. "Poor old Silas," sighed Martha Henderson to her friend, loud enough to be overheard. "Living alone all these years has addled his brain. What's he going to do when winter comes and that boy needs doctoring? The nearest physician is Dr. Hartwell, and he won't stay in town forever." At the general store, proprietor Henry Walsh greeted them with barely concealed skepticism. "Afternoon, Silas. Heard you've taken on quite a responsibility." His eyes flicked to Eli, who stood quietly beside the counter, his dignity intact despite the obvious discomfort of the situation. "Just need supplies, Henry," Silas replied evenly. "The usual, plus some extra provisions." As Henry gathered their order, he couldn't resist offering his unsolicited opinion. "You know, Silas, raising a child is hard enough when they're whole. This boy's going to need special attention, medical care, schooling. Your ranch is barely keeping you afloat as it is." "The boy's got a name," Silas said, his voice carrying a warning edge. "It's Eli. And he's got more sense in his little finger than most grown men in this town have in their whole heads." Eli looked up at Silas with surprise and something that might have been the beginning of trust. No one had ever defended him before, certainly not against the casual cruelty of adults who should have known better. The ride to the McCrae ranch was conducted mostly in silence, but it wasn't the uncomfortable quiet that Eli had expected. Instead, it felt like the peaceful silence between two people who understood that words weren't always necessary. The ranch, when it came into view, was modest but well-maintained. The house was small but sturdy, built to withstand the harsh Kansas winters, and the barn showed signs of recent repair. "It's not much," Silas said as he helped Eli down from the wagon, "but it's honest work and honest living." Eli looked around with keen eyes, taking in the struggling vegetable garden, the small herd of cattle in the distance, and the various outbuildings that spoke of a man trying to make the best of limited resources. "It has potential," he said finally, and Silas was struck by the maturity in the boy's voice. That evening, as they sat on the porch after a simple dinner of beans and cornbread, Eli broke the comfortable silence. "Why did you adopt me?" Silas considered the question, watching the sun paint the sky in shades of orange and purple. "I reckon because we're both fighting the same battle," he said finally. "Both trying to prove we're worth more than what folks think." "And what do you think I'm worth?" Eli asked, his voice small but direct. Silas turned to look at the boy, seeing the vulnerability beneath the brave facade. "I think you're worth exactly what any child is worth, a chance to grow up knowing somebody believes in you." The next morning brought their first real test. Silas had work to do, fences to mend, cattle to check, a dozen tasks that kept a ranch running. In the past, he'd worked alone, but now he had Eli to consider. "I can help," Eli said when Silas explained the day's tasks. "I may not be able to walk well, but my hands work fine, and my mind works better than most." Silas studied the boy's determined expression. and made a decision that would prove more significant than either of them realized. All right then, let's see what you can do. What Eli could do, as it turned out, was remarkable. While Silas worked on repairing a section of fence that had been damaged in a recent storm, Eli sat nearby with a piece of paper and a pencil stub, sketching and calculating. "Mr. McCrae," Eli said after an hour of quiet observation, "what if instead of replacing these fence posts every time the wind knocks them down, we angled them differently? And what if we used a cross-brace system like this?" He showed Silas his sketch, which depicted a fence design that was both stronger and more economical than the traditional method. Silas examined the drawing with growing amazement. The boy had identified the structural weakness in the current fence and devised an elegant solution. "Where did you learn about engineering, son?" "I read," Eli replied simply. "Mrs. Whitmore had some books about building and construction. I thought they were interesting." Over the following days, Eli's suggestions continued to amaze Silas. The boy had ideas for improving water distribution to the cattle, for organizing the barn more efficiently, and for rotating crops in the small garden to improve soil fertility. Each suggestion was practical, well-reasoned, and showed a level of thinking that far exceeded his years. But it was during their weekly trip to town for supplies that Silas truly understood the depth of the challenge they faced. The mockery had not diminished. If anything, it had grown more pointed. "How's that charity case working out for you, Silas?" called out Tom Bradley, the town's deputy sheriff, as they loaded supplies into their wagon. "Bet you're regretting that decision about now. Heard the boy can't even do basic chores," added Frank Morrison with a cruel laugh. "What good is a ranch hand who can't stand on his own 2 feet?" Eli's face flushed with embarrassment and anger, but before he could respond, Silas stepped forward. "That boy has more intelligence and heart than the lot of you combined," he said, his voice carrying the quiet authority of a man who had faced down charging bulls and prairie storms. "And if any of you have a problem with that, you can take it up with me." The crowd fell silent, surprised by the vehemence in Silas's defense. But their silence was temporary, and Silas knew the whispers would start again as soon as they left. That night, as they sat by the fire in the small ranch house, Eli finally voiced what had been troubling him. "Maybe they're right," he said quietly. "Maybe I am just a burden. Maybe you'd be better off without me." Silas set down the harness he'd been mending and looked directly at the boy. "Eli, in the 3 weeks you've been here, you've helped me solve problems I've been struggling with for years. You've shown me ways to improve this ranch that I never would have thought of on my own. If that makes you a burden, then I wish I had a dozen more burdens just like you." Neither Silas nor Eli could have predicted how their partnership would soon transform not only the struggling ranch, but also challenge everything the people of Dodge City thought they knew about worth, potential, and the true meaning of family. The real test of their bond was yet to come, and with it, revelations that would silence the mockers and prove that sometimes the most extraordinary gifts come in the most unexpected packages. Winter arrived early in Kansas that year, bringing with it a harsh reminder of the challenges facing the McCrae Ranch. As the first snows began to fall, Silas found himself facing a crisis that threatened to destroy everything he'd worked to build. The cattle were struggling to find adequate shelter, the water sources were beginning to freeze, and his dwindling savings wouldn't stretch to cover the necessary improvements. It was during this desperate time that Eli Thornton truly began to reveal the extraordinary mind that had been hidden beneath the surface of a disabled orphan boy. "Mr. McCrae," Eli said one morning as they surveyed the struggling herd from the warmth of the kitchen, "I've been thinking about our problems, and I believe I have some solutions." Silas, who had been staring glumly at his account books, looked up with interest. Over the past month, he'd learned to pay attention when Eli said he'd been thinking. The boys' previous suggestions had already improved their fence system and increased their crop yield, but what Eli proposed next would change everything. "The cattle are losing too much body heat in this weather," Eli continued, spreading out a series of detailed drawings on the kitchen table. "But what if we built a windbreak system using the natural contours of the land? And here," he pointed to another sketch, "we could create a warming shelter using reflected heat from the sun, even in winter." Silas examined the drawings with growing amazement. The designs were sophisticated, showing an understanding of physics and engineering that seemed impossible for a 10-year-old boy. Eli, where did you learn about thermodynamics? I found a book about it in the orphanage attic, Eli replied matter-of-factly. It was written by a professor from Harvard. I thought the principles might apply to livestock management. Over the next several days, as they implemented Eli's designs, Silas began to understand that he hadn't just adopted a child, he'd gained a partner whose intellectual gifts were nothing short of extraordinary. The windbreak system not only protected the cattle, but actually improved their health and weight gain. The warming shelter became a gathering point for the herd during the coldest days, and their survival rate improved dramatically. But Eli's innovations didn't stop there. He designed a new irrigation system that used gravity and natural water flow to distribute water more efficiently across their grazing land. He created a feed storage system that prevented spoilage and reduced waste. Most remarkably, he developed a breeding program based on careful observation and record-keeping that promised to improve the quality of their herd over time. The key, Eli explained as he showed Silas his meticulously kept records, is understanding that each animal has individual characteristics that can be enhanced through selective breeding. If we choose the strongest, healthiest animals as breeding stock, we can improve the entire herd's resistance to disease and harsh weather. Word of the improvements at the McCrae Ranch began to spread through Dodge City, though not everyone was ready to believe what they were hearing. When neighboring rancher Jake Thompson visited to see the innovations for himself, his skepticism was evident. "You're telling me that crippled boy came up with all this?" Thompson asked, examining the windbreak system with obvious admiration despite his doubts. "Every bit of it," Silas replied proudly. "And that's just the beginning. Show him the water system, Eli." As Eli explained the principles behind his irrigation design, Thompson's expression gradually changed from skepticism to amazement. The boy's knowledge was comprehensive and practical, his explanations clear and logical. By the time the visit ended, Thompson was shaking his head in wonder. "I've got to admit, Silas, I never would have believed it if I hadn't seen it with my own eyes. That boy's got a mind like nothing I've ever encountered." But it was Dr. Samuel Hartwell's visit that truly marked the turning point in how the town viewed Eli. The distinguished physician had been treating various ailments around Dodge City and had heard rumors about the remarkable innovations at the McCrae Ranch. His scientific curiosity piqued, he requested permission to visit and observe. Dr. Hartwell arrived on a crisp December morning, his medical bag in one hand and a notebook in the other. He was a man in his 50s, with graying hair and intelligent eyes that missed nothing. As Eli guided him through the ranch, explaining each innovation in detail, Dr. Hartwell's questions became increasingly sophisticated. "Your understanding of thermodynamics is quite advanced," Dr. Hartwell observed as Eli explained the heating system for the cattle shelter. "Have you studied the work of Rudolf Clausius?" "I've read about his theories on entropy," Eli replied without hesitation. "I found his ideas about energy transfer particularly relevant to livestock management in harsh climates." Dr. Hartwell stopped walking and stared at the boy. "You've read Clausius? His work is barely understood by university professors. Where did you encounter such advanced material?" "I read everything I can find," Eli said simply. "Mrs. Whitmore at the orphanage used to receive donations of books from wealthy families back east. Most people thought they were too difficult for children, but I found them fascinating." As the tour continued, Dr. Hartwell's amazement grew. Eli's innovations weren't just clever adaptations, they demonstrated a deep understanding of scientific principles that would have been impressive in a graduate student, let alone a 10-year-old boy. "Mr. McCrae," Dr. Hartwell said as they concluded the visit, "you have a remarkable child here. His intellectual gifts are extraordinary. With proper education and guidance, he could make significant contributions to science and engineering." "He's already making contributions," Silas replied, his voice filled with pride. "This ranch was failing before Eli came along. Now we're not just surviving, we're thriving." Dr. Hartwell nodded thoughtfully. "Indeed, but I wonder, has anyone examined his physical condition recently? Medical science has made remarkable advances in recent years." There might be options that weren't available when he was younger. The suggestion hung in the air like a promise, but Silas was hesitant to raise Eli's hopes. The boy had learned to live with his limitations, had built his identity around his intellectual gifts rather than his physical challenges. Still, the possibility intrigued him. That evening, as they sat by the fire, Silas broached the subject carefully. Dr. Hartwell mentioned that there might be new treatments for your condition. Would you be interested in letting him examine you? Eli was quiet for a long moment, staring into the flames. I've learned not to hope for things that can't be changed, he said finally. But if there's really a chance I could walk properly, then yes, I'd like to know. The examination took place the following week in Dr. Hartwell's temporary clinic. As the physician carefully assessed Eli's condition, his expression grew increasingly thoughtful. The damage is significant, Dr. Hartwell explained to both Silas and Eli, but it's not as extensive as I initially feared. The bones healed poorly after the original injury, and the muscles have weakened from disuse. However, I've recently studied a case in Boston that was remarkably similar to yours, Eli. A new surgical technique, combined with an intensive rehabilitation program, restored nearly full function to the patient's legs. Eli's eyes widened with hope and fear in equal measure. You think it might work for me? I believe it's worth attempting, Dr. Hartwell said carefully. The surgery would be complex, and the recovery would be long and difficult. But yes, I believe there's a genuine chance of success. The three men sat in contemplative silence, each understanding that they stood at the threshold of a transformation that could change everything. Eli's intellectual gifts had already begun to reshape the fortunes of the McCrae Ranch and challenge the assumptions of Dodge City's residents. Now, the possibility of physical healing offered the chance for an even more profound transformation. Outside the clinic windows, the winter wind howled across the Kansas plains, but inside, the warmth of hope and possibility filled the room. The boy who had been dismissed as a burden was revealing himself to be a gift beyond measure, and the lonely cowboy who had taken him in was discovering that sometimes the greatest acts of faith yield the most extraordinary rewards. One that would not only transform two lives, but inspire an entire community to reconsider what it meant to see the true worth in another human being. Spring arrived in Dodge City with a burst of wildflowers and renewed hope, but for Silas McCrae and Eli Thornton, the season brought with it the most challenging and transformative period of their lives together. Dr. Samuel Hartwell had spent the winter months preparing for the complex surgery that could potentially restore Eli's ability to walk, and as the day approached, the entire town found itself invested in the outcome. The McCrae Ranch had become something of a local wonder during the harsh winter months. Eli's innovations had not only saved Silas's struggling operation, but had transformed it into one of the most efficient and profitable ranches in the county. Word had spread to neighboring towns, and visitors came regularly to observe the remarkable systems designed by the genius boy, as he'd come to be known. "Never seen anything like it," marveled Colonel James Mitchell, a wealthy rancher from Wichita who had traveled specifically to see Eli's work. "This irrigation system alone could revolutionize cattle ranching across Kansas. And you say the boy designed it all himself?" Silas nodded proudly as he watched Eli demonstrate the gravity-fed water distribution system. "Every innovation you see here came from that boy's mind. He's got a gift for seeing solutions where the rest of us only see problems." But even as their success grew, Eli's thoughts were increasingly focused on the upcoming surgery. Dr. Hartwell had been honest about the risks. The procedure was experimental, and failure could potentially worsen his condition. Yet the possibility of walking normally, of running and riding like other children, was a dream too powerful to ignore. "Are you frightened?" Silas asked one evening as they sat on the porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant oranges and purples. Eli considered the question carefully. "I'm terrified," he admitted, "but not of the surgery itself. I'm afraid that if it doesn't work, I'll have lost something I didn't even know I still had. Hope." Silas placed a gentle hand on the boy's shoulder. "Son, You've already accomplished more in your 10 years than most men do in a lifetime. Whether this surgery works or not, you're already a miracle. The day of the surgery arrived with unseasonable warmth and clear skies. Dr. Hartwell had converted a room in the hotel into a makeshift operating theater, bringing in equipment and supplies from as far away as Kansas City. The entire town seemed to hold its breath as Eli was prepared for the procedure. "I want you to know," Eli said to Silas just before the surgery began, "that even if this doesn't work, these months with you have been the happiest of my life. You gave me something I never had before, a family." Silas felt his throat tighten with emotion. "You gave me something too, son. You gave me a reason to believe in tomorrow." The surgery lasted nearly 6 hours. Dr. Hartwell worked with meticulous precision, carefully realigning bones that had healed incorrectly and repairing damaged muscle tissue. Silas paced the hotel lobby, joined by an unexpected gathering of townspeople who had come to wait for news. Among them was Mrs. Whitmore from the orphanage, tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. "That boy was always special," she whispered to Martha Henderson. "I just never imagined how special." Even some of Eli's former tormentors had come to wait. Frank Morrison, the banker who had once mocked Silas's decision to adopt a crippled boy, stood quietly in the corner, his face etched with concern. "I was wrong," he admitted to anyone who would listen. "Dead wrong about that boy and about Silas." When Dr. Hartwell finally emerged from the makeshift operating room, his face was drawn with exhaustion but bright with cautious optimism. "The surgery went better than I dared hope," he announced to the gathered crowd. "The bones were successfully realigned, and I was able to repair more of the muscle damage than I anticipated. Now, we wait and see how well he heals." The recovery was long and arduous. For weeks, Eli remained bedridden, his legs immobilized while the surgical repairs healed. But his mind remained as active as ever, and he used the time to design new improvements for the ranch and to teach himself advanced mathematics from books that Dr. Hartwell brought from his personal library. "You know," Dr. Hartwell observed during one of his daily visits, "I've been corresponding with colleagues at Harvard Medical School about your case, Eli. They're quite interested in your intellectual abilities as well as your physical recovery. There's talk of offering you a scholarship when you're older." Eli's eyes lit up with excitement, but he glanced at Silas with concern. "I wouldn't want to leave the ranch. This is my home now." "Education doesn't have to mean leaving forever," Silas assured him. "But you've got gifts that could help a lot of people, son. When the time comes, we'll figure out how to make it work." The first attempt at standing came 6 weeks after the surgery. Dr. Hartwell had designed a series of exercises to gradually strengthen Eli's legs and retrain his muscles. The entire town seemed to know about the milestone, and a small crowd gathered outside the clinic windows. With Dr. Hartwell supporting one arm and Silas the other, Eli slowly rose from his wheelchair. His legs trembled with the effort, unused to bearing weight after so many years. But they held. For the first time since early childhood, Eli Thornton stood on his own 2 feet. The crowd outside erupted in cheers, and even the stoic Dr. Hartwell had to wipe away tears. But it was Silas's reaction that moved Eli most. The tough cowboy who had faced down stampedes and storms without flinching was openly weeping with joy. "How does it feel?" Dr. Hartwell asked. Eli took a tentative step, then another. His gait was unsteady, and he would need months of rehabilitation to build strength and coordination, but he was walking. "It feels like flying," he whispered. The transformation in the town's attitude toward both Silas and Eli was remarkable. The same people who had once mocked the lonely cowboy's decision to adopt a disabled child now spoke of him with admiration and respect. Children who had once taunted Eli now sought him out, eager to hear about his inventions and innovations. "You know what the most amazing thing is?" observed Judge Crawford as he watched Eli demonstrate his latest creation, a mechanical device for automatically distributing feed to the cattle. "It's not just that the boy can walk again. It's that he's shown us all what's possible when someone believes in you." As summer arrived, the McCrae Ranch had become a model of innovation and efficiency. Visitors came from across the state to observe Eli's systems, and several universities had expressed interest in documenting his work. But more importantly, the bond between Silas and Eli had deepened into something unbreakable. "I've been thinking," Eli said one evening as they worked together to repair a section of fence, a task he could now perform standing upright. "Maybe my real purpose wasn't just to walk again. Maybe it was to show people that everyone has value, even when they can't see it themselves." Silas smiled at the wisdom in the boy's words. "I think you might be right about that, son. You certainly showed me things I never would have seen on my own." The story of Silas McCrae and Eli Thornton became legend in Dodge City and beyond. The lonely cowboy who had taken in an unwanted child had gained not just a son, but a partner whose gifts had transformed their lives and inspired an entire community. The disabled boy who had been written off as a burden had proven that the human spirit, when nurtured with love and belief, could overcome any obstacle. As autumn returned to the Kansas plains, painting the landscape in brilliant golds and reds, Silas and Eli stood together on their porch, watching the sunset over land that was now prosperous and productive. The ranch that had once struggled to survive was now a testament to innovation and determination. "Do you ever regret it?" Eli asked. "Taking a chance on someone everyone said was hopeless?" Silas wrapped his arm around the boy's shoulders, marveling at how much had changed since that day at the orphanage. "Son, you weren't the one who was hopeless. I was. You saved me just as much as I saved you." In the distance, the cattle grazed peacefully in pastures improved by Eli's innovations, and the sound of their contentment carried on the evening breeze. It was the sound of dreams fulfilled, of second chances embraced, and of a love that had transformed two lonely souls into an unbreakable family. The people of Dodge City had learned a valuable lesson about the danger of judging others by their limitations rather than their possibilities. And in the years to come, whenever someone spoke of the power of compassion and the miracle of believing in another human being, they would tell the story of the lonely cowboy and the boy who could barely walk, and how together they had learned to fly. Hello, how are you? Did you enjoy the story? Like, share, comment on which city you're watching from, and subscribe to the channel to help us continue adding new amazing videos. Thank you very much, and come back often.